What a concept. Okay, we talked about concepts. Now let's put them to the test. So the classical view was a view of necessary and sufficient conditions. Prototype view I described as being more abstract. You pick some common features, and everything that is similar enough gets to count, and everything that's not similar enough doesn't get to count. And so you have some things that are sort of halfway in. Exemplar is not abstract. You pick a concrete representation, and anything that's similar enough to that gets to count, gets to be more active in your memory. So from prototype views, the basic idea is you go from the most typical to the most common. In the exemplar view, you go from the most common to the most typical. So you find typical traits, and then you describe the view or the category based on those in prototypes. With exemplars, you pick an entity that comes to mind. And remember, we were talking about this with respect to decision theory, decision making in behavioral economics. Sometimes we choose the wrong exemplar in making our concepts. One weird aspect of prototypes is that the typicality, the things that are most typical, could be a fiction. There could literally be nothing that fills all of the typical features, and yet most things would have most of them. Same with the opposite will happen with the exemplars. You might actually change your exemplar from time to time. We use exemplars, for example, when we talk about type specimens in biology. What gets to count as a brontosaurus is based on a particular fossil, a particular skeleton. We pick type specimens and we say, no, anything similar to it, that gets to be the species. We use prototypes other times. Read that word, T-A-V-E. How would you pronounce it? Just try to pronounce it right now. So it turns out that the different views make different predictions. Under the prototype view, you would read it as tave because there are hundreds of words that sound like tave, like ave, like behave. On the exemplar view, you'd predict tav, because have is the most common AVE word in English. So which did you do? It turns out when you do these studies with undergraduates, about 90% of them go with TAVE. Okay, it's one particular prediction, one particular time. All right. On the other hand, it seems like when we task undergraduates to learn categories, exemplar theories are more predictive. Some people argue that this is a problem, that this is just like an artifact of lab conditions. We usually don't encounter the same bird again and again when we make a new category of bird. And weirdly, when we're faced with many exemplars, it turns out that prototype theories become more predictive again. So TAVE seems to be evidence for prototype theory. All of the examples of learning concepts depends on how many concepts you force undergraduates to learn in a lab condition. If you ask them to learn a concept of like pink elephants, they will pick a particular one. But if you ask them to learn, if you give them many examples of pink elephants, prototype theory will end up choosing the shared features rather than a particular entity. What about combining concepts? One of the interesting things about concepts is that they're pretty easy to slap together. You can have the concept of floating and the concept of mountain, and now you've just created a new concept, a floating mountain. And weirdly, sometimes when you combine them, you get entirely new results. Pet plus bird invokes cage, but neither pet nor bird do. So sometimes the particular combination creates a brand new thing. Sometimes you combine them in particular ways that are helpful. You group zebras and horses, and other ways are really hard to group. Like zebras and houses, it's hard to come up with a concept that unites them. Prototype theories, again, are going to win out here with conceptual combinations. They're pretty easy to just combine abstract properties, and some things will fit and other things won't. Exemplars are tricky because you have to pick a particular one, and there's no floating mountain that you've found anywhere in your lives that you will liken that to. Although you might actually be picturing a particular mountain you've seen when you think floating mountain. Some people say, well, why not? ¿Por qué no los dos? And I mean, I don't know. So, like, the way this would work would be something like, there is a particular entity that you think of when I say the word, think of a pet. You don't think of somebody having a pet lobster. But the way you group them, the way you group pets will be more likely to be based on a prototype view. Okay. All right, so all of this so far might have just seemed like kind of interesting philosophical hand-wringing. We've got some ways that we group things. It turns out Aristotle was wrong, but he was wrong about everything, or about a lot of things. Why should we be particularly concerned about this? And then the differences between prototypes and exemplars. Okay, sure. There's some weird quirks about how I group the world I live in, but I just do it, right? I'm imagining some of you having that skeptical reaction. So the next section will try to bring the point of it home. Just remember that concepts are representations about the world, and they serve as meanings of words. Furthermore, concepts are public. Otherwise, we could never communicate with each other. This actually is going to raise one of the deeper problems here. Like, when you say to your partner, I love you, does your partner interpret it in the exact same way that you meant it? It may be that we spend most of our day just trying to be clear about concepts, and we all have different associations, and so we are constantly just miscommunicating with each other left and right. That would be expected if our concepts were non-classical, right? So I say bird, and I'm thinking of vulture. You say bird, and you're thinking of a penguin. And I describe birds as being scary and just jerks, and you think, well, no, they're cute. And it may be that some similarities some features of those concepts are more salient to you than others, and some similarities between different entities are going to be more salient to you than to me. And so even though we both think the concept bird, you are going to be more likely to go to puffin than I am. I wouldn't necessarily think of a puffin as a bird. So there's this concept or this idea called conceptual slippage, where we use the same term to refer to slightly different concepts. And sometimes we do this and it's not a problem. In fact, arguably we do this all the time. And only rarely do we have to like issue a press release apology. Other times we make these mistakes where we are miscommunicating with each other in some deep fundamental way that's really, really hard to get a handle on. I think a lot of politics might be like this. A lot of relationship problems might be like this, roommate problems. All right, so concepts might matter with respect to slippage. If you keep making those same mistakes, that might be an issue. But where do we even get these concepts from in the first place? We all have concepts and we all think we can communicate with each other. They come up in any environment we're in. We tend to have a lot of the same concepts. So some people think, well, maybe concepts are innate, because innate traits are those that emerge everywhere. Well, at least in most places, innate traits wouldn't emerge if you died in the womb or something. You don't acquire them from the environment. You just acquire them normally. You're predisposed to them. There's some concerns that happen when we get to innateness, which in the next section, after this, we're going to be talking about biology and talking about some innate issues there. So that's going to matter there. But what environments matter? How do we distinguish normal from abnormal environments, stable from unstable? What about rare innate traits that don't appear all the time? So I'm foreshadowing some things that are gonna come in future videos about innateness. But it's gonna be, right now we're talking about conceptual innateness. How do our thoughts acquire their meaning? In the next couple of units, we're gonna talk about modularity of the mind and evolutionary psychology. The idea being that some features of our mind might be more innate than others. So here's the debate about innate concepts. How do we come to learn them? Well, it could be that they are innate, or that the disposition to learn them is innate. Or they're not innate at all, we learn them all from our environment. The last one I have to include for the sake of completeness, eliminativism, which is there's no way to discern innate aspects. All concepts are this complex mush of gene by environment interactions. And so there's no way to actually like attribute what portions of them as innate or acquired by the environment. Everything is everything. So we'll start off with conceptual nativism, which will be the majority of this. This is the view that there's just so many possible concepts, and yet humans come to learn the same concepts again and again. We learn concepts about color, about life, about health, about governments, about various things. We're going to talk about arguments for persistence. I'm going to remind you of the poverty of the stimulus argument, and then we're going to talk about a couple of other arguments for that. The very argument in favor of innate concepts sort of raises a problem for it. And we saw this with language, and it's a problem for anything that's innate, really. Can we really have hundreds of thousands of innate concepts? Could we really have that for grammar, for example? So we'll go through a couple of these arguments that span hundreds of years of philosophy. You look at this candle, and over time, it will melt to become just wax if you leave it burning long enough. You light a candle, you leave the room, and you come back and you see just a ball of wax. And you think, some hoodlum stole my candle and replaced it with wax. No, you think it was the candle that melted. So you identify the candle with the wax in some way. It persists, the substance persists. How did you get that concept that there was something about the candle that would be left over? In the people that argue for innateness will say that we have this tendency to think about entities as persisting over time. And that's how we go about the world. We don't get constantly surprised by new environments because we think about the entities persisting from one previous time to the future. Like, think about the computational load of rendering every single thing every single time you experience it. You remember the poverty of the stimulus argument? I'm just going to remind you of it, that Noam Chomsky argued that there's just too many possible, like the combinatoric possibilities of language are pretty high up there, if not actually infinite. But there's so many more possibilities than the amount that we experience, and yet we learn language and we're good at language pretty early on. Therefore, we must have some innate capacity to learn language. Therefore, there is some innateness. And you might say the same thing for concepts. There's an infinite number of concepts that you can infer from the environment. I'll develop that a little bit more after this. Let's say you are in an island somewhere, and you're talking to the native peoples, and they see a rabbit running past, and they shout out the word gavagai. It could be that their concept is the same as yours. They just used a different word. For you, you would look at it and say, oh, it's a rabbit. They would say gavagai. Or maybe they're looking at it because they're going to hunt it, and they think about it as food. So gavagai actually just means dinner or something, food. Maybe it's a superstitious culture, and they shout out gavagai because this is a sign in their culture that if a rabbit runs in front of them, it's going to rain later. Or maybe they're a really, really developed physics culture that doesn't think in terms of A or B theory of time. They don't think about objects. Instead, they think about temporal slices, like just seconds of slicing of time. And they think, oh, at this particular instance, that is a rabbit stage. The word gavagai in a completely new context is indeterminate. There are so many ways of structuring your concepts that you've just taken it for granted how you structure it. And so the person that argues for innateness is going to say, oh, that's just your culture. Or sorry, that's just your biology. You're predisposed to thinking about objects. Because even though you might imagine cultures having the top three, it's really, really hard for you to imagine a culture with the momentary rabbit stage idea of rabbits. It's logically possible, it's just weird. The people that are not nativist or not about innate concepts will think, no, they're all possible. It just so happens that our culture tends to go to the ones that are less cognitively heavy. Okay, so there's an infinite number of concepts you can have. Any amount of evidence can fit any amount of concepts. Let's say I show you this graph. At every instance, at time 1, it measures 1. At time 5, it measures 5. At time 10, it measures 10. At time 13, it measures 13. And then you say, okay, what's the next measurement going to be? It's all logically consistent to say any number, really. it looks like it's a continued increase, but that's because you're trained to look for continued increases. It may just be that all of these were numbers less than 14. Or there's an infinite number of logically possible next steps. And to show you that, imagine you're a geologist. In a world that never discovered jade. You find an example of jade and it has a specific gravity of 2.94, or hardness of 6, an index of refraction of 1.65. You find hundreds of other examples that all are between 2.9 and 3.1, hardness of 6, an index of refraction that's pretty similar. This is greater similarity than most minerals. And so you coin this term after your favorite Beatles song, or there's no student named Jade in this class. I have a student named Jade in my other class. Your favorite Beatles song. Actually, Jade, it's Jude. Damn it, whatever, it doesn't matter. Who cares? I'm not gonna edit this. Hey, Jade. And you say, okay, this is a thing, everything like this is gonna be jade. And then you draw more conclusions. You say, okay, jade rocks are green, jade rocks have this gravity, jade rocks have this hardness, jade rocks have an index like this. But then somebody discovers that you were actually confusing two different rocks, jadeite and nephrite. In fact, 90% of them are nephrite, 10% are jadeite, and they're formed through radically different processes. There's no such thing as jade according to geology. There might still be a cultural category of jade, even though it doesn't, exist in nature. Kind of like the category vegetables, a thing that we use for tax purposes based on agricultural demands. There's no such thing as a vegetable, or at least biologically speaking. Same with jade. So we have these concepts that you thought were one thing, but it wasn't. Logic alone isn't going to isn't going to distinguish between the different possible concepts. Instead, there must be something that is more plausible to you about some ways of grouping things than others. It seems ridiculous to think that given 13 data points that all keep going up, that the next one's going to be something that's not 14. It seems crazy to think that you were studying two different rocks. We're really, really good at reading some kinds of patterns. So our mind is predisposed to certain concepts. And the negative patterns, or the weird combinations of patterns, the disjunctive concepts, even though they're just as plausible and they would make sense of our evidence just as well, we just really, really, really don't like thinking that way. And so this is a final argument for innateness, the basic idea that we're just naturally disposed to grouping categories in a certain way. Now you'll notice that in the discussion of innateness, I slid between some concepts being innate and dispositions to learn concepts as being innate. I don't think that distinction matters as much, but some people will be annoyed by that. So maybe that's just how we are built biologically, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's we learn how to learn concepts from our culture. We favor concepts that are of a certain sort, but maybe if we were raised in a very different culture, we would break the world down into very different concepts, very different categories. So this is the view known as conceptual empiricism, and it's basically just against nativism. Toasters are not innate. There's no way they could be. Our ancestors didn't have toasters. And yet we we think about toasters just as reasonably as we think about trees and predators. Like, we can make those concepts just as easily. And so if we could be fooled by toasters, which our ancestors could not have had access to, then we ought to think that all concepts are learned from the environment. They're all learned from experience. And our culture is such that we spend a lot of time correcting each other. Like, look at new parents when they see a baby, they like, or a child learning language, they constantly try to like quiz them on colors. The child doesn't want to classify the world into colors. The parents are like, what color is this? Is it blue? It's blue. But I guess we just really, really want that child to learn the concepts that will help them succeed in the world. That's helpful for certain concepts, but it's kind of weird for abstract concepts. So this is a gradient, and I cut out a shade of blue. Suppose you'd lived your entire life and had never seen that particular shade of blue. Could you imagine what color blue that is? Maybe. If you think you can, you might not be an empiricist. If you think you cannot, well, I don't know. The basic idea is that there are some things that require perception to actually develop the concept of. You need to have actually seen that shade at some point. This is going to go back to the colorblind hard problem of consciousness discussion, colorblind Mary. You've also never seen a perfect circle. You can infer it. So there's a circle, but in fact, actually, it's got 1,000 sides. It's a 1,000-sided figure. When you zoom in, actually, I'm pretty sure it's not. I think it's just a blurry circle. but you can imagine a 1,000-sided entity looking like this. So you can infer based on your experience. It's weird to think that you'd have some innate category of that. I don't know. I mean, I don't have strong feelings in the innateness of concepts discussion, or even the concepts back and forth. I think prototypes and exemplars can both be useful at for different reasons. It is a debate, and innateness is going to become a debate when we get to biology. I think it might make sense that there are some ways of viewing the world that are innate, but a lot of other aspects are not. So with that, I'm just gonna stop this video and move on. Have a good week.